Thank you very much for coming here tonight. Can you hear me? Great. And I'd like to thank Japan Society for giving me opportunity to talk about the subject that I'm so passionate about. So I'm going to talk about designing mindfulness, but I'm not clearly a monk, and, and I'm not a philosopher either. I'm fundamentally a practicing architect and consultant who is so passionate about creating the space that is good for your mind as well as your body. So the creative and sort of a practical goal of mine, I hope, will help me to convey this topic, which is rather philosophical. So today, I start with mind and body and space and those relationships, and then go to the quality of the space that makes us feel mindful, and then discuss how Japanese spatial concepts contribute to that quality. Our mind does not have a form. Then how could we even think about the possibility that the physical environment, the space, could influence our mind? That is because our mind is an integral part of our body, and our body is a part of the physical environment, which we tend to forget. We tend to think that the space is just to look at. But I'm sure that the dancers here at Jacob's Pillow dancing outside are really feeling that they are part of the space. So our body can not only see the space, but can smell it, listen to it, and touch it, and communicate those sensations to our mind. And at the same time, our mind perceives something out of the space and tells that to our body. So if you are walking this very nice path in Kyoto, surrounded by bamboo, and if your blood pressure decreased while you're walking, it could be because your mind perceived something and that decreased your blood pressure. Or it could be because your nose smelled the nice smell of bamboo and that decreased your blood pressure. So these three are related to each other. And although that we discuss primarily about the mind-space relationship, we shouldn't forget that there are two other relationships between mind and body and space. Definition. How many of you practice or try to practice mindfulness or meditation? Oh, that's great, that's great. So I may not even have to define it, but just to remind you, it is to focus your awareness on the present moment, non-judgmentally. So it's not about closing your eyes and shutting out the world. What kind of space makes us feel mindfulness then? We don't have a lot of information, scientifically proved information, but we have a very reliable hint, which is how our mind perceives the space when we are mindful. When we are mindful, the boundary between the space and body is blurred. In Zen Buddhism, the definition of true mindfulness is the condition under which the space and you are separated but connected at the same time. So in a sense, the perception of the space like this way, the losing or blurring the boundary between yourself and the space, is the definition of mindfulness. And the modern Japanese philosophers supported that idea too. Yasuo Yuasa, a philosopher, interpreted the idea of well-known philosopher Kitaro Nishida. He was a philosopher from early 20th century, and said that when we are meditating, our conscious mind receded to become very close to zero, and our unconscious mind acted toward the physical environment directly without responding to the sensation from our body. So what's happening then is that because our logical and conscious mind, as well as our body, do not intervene, we don't feel the boundary between our body and the space. And in neuroscience, a study found out that in the brains of meditating monks, the coordination between the internal and external environment of the monks increased when they are meditating. Again, that suggests that when we are mindful, the boundary between the self and space is blurred. Is the opposite true? Through the years of Japanese study on Japanese architecture, I'm pretty much confident to say that Japanese spatial concepts make the self-space boundary blur. That's the first part of the sentence regarding Japanese architecture, right? And at the same time, many of us experience that Japanese architecture and garden make us feel more mindful, or at least contemplative. So that's the second part of the sentence. And although the causality between them was not really scientifically proven, we get the idea, right? It seems that through making the self-space boundary blur, Japanese architecture and gardens are making us feel more mindful or contemplative. So for the rest of my talk, I'd like to introduce you how Japanese spatial concepts make the self-space boundary blur. But before going into that Japanese specific, I really would like to feel how it is like to lose the self-space boundary, because it's not easy. I asked that question once to my architecture student, and one of the students gave me this excellent answer. You could lose the self-space boundary when you are under the water. You can easily imagine that, right? And also it explains why so many of us would like to fly to Bermuda and dive into the water. Any case, this idea also gave us a lot of information of what elements of the space could make us lose or blur the self-space boundary. For one thing, when you are under the water, you cannot see well because the water reflects the light in a different way from the air does. So that's one thing. Second, when you are under the water, your surroundings, your space is always moving. And it is moving not necessarily as a big single mass, but in many cases as a combination of many different water currents whose boundaries we don't see. And then third, when you are under the water, you are always moving because you cannot stop still. And when you move under the water, you are moving not necessarily according to your will because water moves you too. So you see, you don't see well, your surroundings are moving in a way that you don't see, and you are moving under the water. And very interestingly, Japanese spatial concept make the self-space boundary blur in almost exactly the same way as the water does. You don't see well, that's yugen, the art of untold and unknown. Your surroundings are moving in a way that you don't see is called ma and hashi. Your surroundings is moving and you are moving. That's called utsuroi and Mitsuki. And I'd like to talk much more about it by showing the actual examples. So let me start with you cannot see well. Yugen means the art of untold and unknown. And it's a concept that is appreciated in many different art fields in Japan. In 12th century, a very well-known monk and poet, Kamono Chome, said that when looking at autumn mountains in the mist, the view may be indistinct, yet have very great depths. What he meant by that is that imagined landscape, you have to imagine it because of the mist, right? So the imagined landscape is much richer and deeper than the one your eyes see. This appreciation toward the yugen came at least partially from Japanese climate. Japan is a country of islands surrounded by the ocean, so its climate is humid. And because the mountains, high mountains, are very close to the water, you see often mist and fog, and also the weather changed often. So the familiarity creates the appreciation to this idea. So whether it is poem or paintings or no performances, the idea is that when you don't show all of them, keeping something mysterious, you can convey much more. And interestingly, mysteriousness is one of the very few characteristics of the space that is scientifically proved to be good for your health. How could you create the mysteriousness? A study found out that the contrast between the light and shadow improves your impression of the healing in a better way. And they also said that's because it steers your imagination toward the unknown world. Here you see tsuboniwa, a typical courtyard for Machiya townhouse. And in Japanese gardens and architecture, you don't normally see a very bright spot or a very dark spot. Instead, you see the different degrees of light and different degrees of shadow. Another way of making mysteriousness, another obvious way, I should say, is not showing all. And this study found that the people much prefer the image of architecture regardless to the styles of architecture when a part of it is hidden by trees. And this is actually a very great shock to me because all through my life, I was trained to design a beautiful piece of architecture, and people much prefer it when it's hidden. That's a sad thing. The second category is a group of Japanese spatial concepts that make the self-space boundary blur is boundary emotion. And one of the Japanese terms for it is ma. Ma is probably the most well-known Japanese concept, and it's kind of presided over other spatial concepts. It is on the top of the hierarchy of the concept. And the generally means a gap or interstice. The Chinese character that is used for ma signifies the image of a gate made out of two doors and the moonlight coming through it. But ma is not as simple as the space made out of two doors and moonlight. It is much more fluid. And I like to explain that by showing a very quick video. Oops. Imagine this red ink is one space, and the blue ink is another space. These two spaces are constantly working toward each other, creating a boundary that is always changing its forms as well as its color. So the purplish boundary that you see here, without really the edge and the changing its color, is the image of ma. One of the subsidiary concepts of ma is called hashi, and its general meaning is an edge or edge condition. And the origin of this pronunciation of hashi is actually a boat or a barge. So when you say hashi or edge in Japanese language, it always carries this image of a boat going in between the two shores, probably unconsciously from the speaker's or writer's mind. And two things that I'd like to point out here. One is the boundary is boat, so it's always moving. And another thing is there is a person or people on the boat. You are on the boat. You are on the boundary. There are four other meanings for the same pronunciation of hashi, usually expressed by four different Chinese characters. One of them is periphery, so it generally means a wider range of space than boundary. If the boundary is a line, periphery is a wider space. And interestingly, three other meanings are all architecture elements. Veranda is clearly a boundary. It is the boundary between the outside and inside. But I like to point out that Japanese verandas are open not only to the outside, but they are also open to the inside. Two others, a bridge and stairs, are even more interesting because in Western or modern understanding, a bridge or stairs are not the boundary. They are considered to be connection, right? But in Japanese concept, they are part of the boundaries in motion. And I like to show this concept by using Itsukushima Shrine in Hiroshima, because that shrine has or include all 5 different hashi, different boundary in motion. Oops. To visit Itsukushima Shrine, you have to take a boat because it's on a tiny island across from Hiroshima City. So you are already on the boundary. And what you see in front of you is a torii gate marking the territory of shrine. But in reality, you can ride in from any direction to this shrine. So it's an open and it's an open boundary in motion. And once you are on the island, that's what you see. The shrine campus is half enclosed by these a sort of a cloister-like open corridors. And because these boundaries are transparent, you can see the architecture inside as well as the one behind it. And this half transparency or transparency is very important and interesting trick that you can play in creating boundary emotion. And then you proceed more, and you are now in that cloister-like corridor, or I should say veranda. And now you can feel that this space is not only separating the inside and outside of Shrine campus, but also connecting them together. This shrine also has hashi as a bridge. The bridge is connecting and separating the sphere that belongs to gods and spirits and the one that you are in for the human beings. Now you are live in front of the main buildings of the shrine, and that's what you see. In front of you is the raised stage on which performances and dances are dedicated to gods and spirits. So the space on the stage is more sacred than the one that you are standing on. Therefore, two different spaces, right? And the stairs, although it's just a couple of steps, are making the boundary in motion. So in this shrine, you saw all these different kinds of boundaries in motion, like the boundaries in between the different water currents when you are under the water. And you were on the boundary. The third group of Japanese spatial concepts that make the self-space boundary blur include the changing space and moving self, moving you. And Japanese spaces are made to appreciate and emphasize these changes and moves. One of the Japanese terms for it is called utsuroi, and it means a gradual and inevitable change from one status to the other. Another meaning of utsuroi is the reflection or projection of one thing to the other. So in both of these meanings, what utsuroi suggests is that nothing is reliable and everything is ephemeral. The term utsuroi is often used to describe the landscape and symbolize the changing season, as well as the moment at which the peak of either the event or thing is passing. The event is going over its peaks. So when it's used for the flower, like in this case cherry blossoms, it means that the petals of the flower has just started to fall. Phoenix Hall at Byodo in Kyoto is an excellent example of utsuroi. This is considered to be at the final stage of Japanization of Chinese temple complex. The Chinese temple complex has the surrounding solid building, like the walls and buildings, and within it, they have important buildings. What happened over the years of Japanization is it somehow flattened to the extent to become the linear building, like this Phoenix Hall. So in a way, the Phoenix Hall is the silhouette or reflection of the original Chinese temple campus. And at the same time, over the years, people started to place the large chunk of water in front of the building. either the real water or imagined water. And that creates another silhouette. So what we see here is just two different silhouettes. One, the silhouette of three-dimensional objects, one, the silhouette of something above the ground. And we don't know which one is the real one. Nothing is reliable. Utsuroi is a very important concept for garden design too. In the oldest Japanese landscape book that was written in the 11th century, it says that it is best to plant trees that flowers on the eastern side of the garden, and to plant trees that change its colors in the fall on the western side, so that you can enjoy the flowering trees with the rising sun and enjoy the colored leaves with the setting sun. So what is suggesting, encouraging, is to design the garden that appreciate not only the time of the day, changing time of the day, as well as the changing season of the year. You might contest that the dry gardens, or some people call Zen gardens, are not changing. However, the ground, the pebbled ground, or the white sand, represent the water. So the dry garden is not changing or moving physically, but it is moving in your imagination. Architecture interior respond to this idea of utsuroi too by incorporating a lot of different temporal elements. And what you see here is the summer setting of a mature townhouse. So people just brought out the transparent or half-transparent elements, such as the screens and scrolls, and just taken out the solid elements like fusuma, sliding door. The next and the last concept that I'm going to introduce is moving self, moving you. And that's called Mitsuki in Japanese. Remember that you cannot stop still in the water. That's the same thing. And Mitsuki means traveling from one place to the other. But it refers to the space that you covered by traveling. At the same time, the time that you spent for traveling. Japanese people's fascination toward this idea of Mitsuki is again apparent in many different arts, including this ukiyo-e wood block prints, where you see the people traveling, and also in the subjects of kabuki theatrical performances. But by translating Mitsuki as traveling, something is missing in translation, because Mitsuki has a lot to do with the first concept, yugen. If yugen is the idea of hiding something from people, from the artist's point of view or God's point of view, Mitsuki is the idea of looking the same thing from the other side. When you're doing traveling, your views are always half blocked. Let me explain that by using these diagrams. These diagrams show two different paths represented in a very usual architectural way. You're looking at the space from above, and each of it has the identical set of 8 different places from place A and place H. And the gray hatching represent the darkness, so that these paths are in the darkness. These two paths are different. You think they are different because you're looking from the above like you are GPS. However, it's a different story if you are the person who is going through the path. So let us try that. Imagine that you go through the path A, starting from the left side. You go straight to path A, place A. You turn sort of right to place B. You make another left turn to C, and then, so you go straight to the right to go to B, and then make a left turn to C, and then another left to go to D, right? And if you are to try the path B, here's what happened. You go straight to place A, turn right to go to B, turn left to go to C, another left to go to D. So straight, right, left, and left. If you are the person going through them, path A and path B are identical. And that's the idea of, I guess, the perception of the space in terms of Michiyuki. When you do Michiyuki, Cartesian layout of the places are not important at all because you cannot perceive them. What is important is what spaces that you experience, in what order, and what timing. And I'd like to show this to you by using the example of Katsura Detached Palace or Katsura Imperial Villa. And in showing them, I hope that you could also see other spatial concepts that we already discussed today. Katsura was built in early 17th century over the 30 or 40 years. It started only with the old shoin, and they added metal shoin, music pavilion, and then shingoten over the years. So this architecture itself was changing architecture, representing idea of utsuroi. But let me start you for your Michiyuki traveling, starting from that red triangle, which is the central gate. So you are central gate, but the gate is open, so it's a boundary in motion. But even though it is open, the space is created so that you will slow down, because the space requires a lot of attention. For one thing, the vertical elements on your right and left are different. On the right, you see the bamboo and straw fence, and on the left, you see the plants. And also, the finish of the ground changes. You're now standing on the sand, I should say, sandwiched by the moss. But you are going to step on the paving made out of the smaller stones, and then you go to the larger stone. And the attention required slow you down, just as water somewhat moves you when you're under the water. Another thing that may slow you down here is, although you could see the building behind the gate, you cannot see the entrance. Because the path when you go under, the path that you walk through after the gate is going diagonally. It's almost like a 45 degrees. And then you are in front of the entrance. Entrance door is made out of thin paper of shoji screen. So it is flexible, it is boundary in motion, but just enough to hide your view. You cannot see something behind you, mysteriousness. And this is what you see when you are invited into Katsura. You are in the second room, looking at the first room. But if you turn your head here to the left, That's what you see, moon viewing veranda, which is open to the inside as well as to the outside. And then you proceed from old showing to middle showing. And you see the series of a sliding door, Fusuma sliding door, which are currently open only for the photo shooting. But in reality, what you need to do to proceed is to, they are closed usually, and you have to open the one in front of you. You go into the next room and close the door behind you. And then to go to the next room, you have to open it and closing it behind you. So you do this small ceremony every time you go into the next space that reminds you that you are going over the boundary. You are on the boundary. At the same time, this opening and closing and opening, closing create different degrees of light and different degrees of shadow. And when you go straight, and then you are at that shoji screen, and here you are in the middle showing, underneath the eaves of the roof. And because you have this shoji screen on your right, you feel that you are within the architecture, within the building. But when we open up this shoji screen on the right, you can see it's completely open to the extent that you cannot tell if you are outside and inside. And please remember you already made 2 turns. And you make 2 more turns, and you are at Music Pavilion looking back the middle showing that you were just at. And make even 2 more turns to reach to Shingoten, looking back the Music Pavilion as well as the middle showing. And finally, you are at the deepest corner of Shingoten. And here you see that the Shingoten is small, and in this very small quarter of the architecture, even there, neither your body nor your sight line or view cannot go straight because of the meandering way the spaces combine each other, and the boundary are in motion. So this is actually a complex that you just traveled through. Now you could see the middle showing on the right, Music Pavilion and Shingoten. You can see the structure like the perspective that we architects use in modern times. But this is actually the view that you will never have when you are invited guests of Katsura. And even when you are invited through the gardens, if you ever taken the tour of Katsura Palace in Kyoto, this is actually the final spot that you stand. So you don't see this very clear view until the last moment. I hope by now you understood how doing Michiyuki in Katsura is somewhat similar to be under the water, because your views are always half blocked and your surroundings are moving in a way that you don't really see because the boundaries are moving. And then in the space that appreciate the changes, you were always moving. So today I discussed how Japanese spatial concepts make the self-space boundary blur. And because of that, we can feel when we are in Japanese architecture and garden that we feel more mindful and contemplative. And best part for you to get this knowledge is to be mindful. You don't have to fly to Bermuda any longer. Because you have these tools to use to make the space, that makes you more mindful. And Japanese architecture and garden developed these ideas over 1,000 years. You might say that these concepts and tricks are rather abstract, but remember, these are buildable concepts. If it is philosophy, these are the buildable philosophy. As you saw in Katsura and Itsukushima, they're not imagination, they're there. And I actually appreciate the fact that they are somewhat abstract, precisely because they are abstract, we can translate them into the contemporary space. And that's exactly what I do every day at my office, translating these concepts into the contemporary gardens, homes, and offices. And I hope when you go home, you try that yourself, the translation. And if you find it too difficult or challenging or have questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much.
Hi, I was wondering if you could give us a few examples of how you apply those principles to architecture where they're not present yet, such as in an office.
That's a very good and very big question. And that's it's not a secret, but what I need to do, and what, if you like to do it, what you need to do is to think about, let's say, if it is the mysteriousness, how you can hide the things behind the people, or how you can slow people down without forcing them. That's, I think, the big challenge in applying this concept. And in doing that, requires a lot of thinking and a lot of planning. And that's all I can say. And that's why we design things very precisely. And that's why although that you notice that the Katsura Detached Palace give you those senses, you probably didn't notice if you were ever there, right? Until I pointed out. And that's very important thing for designing anything in a way that not to make the space, make the tricks so that people not to notice it.
Okay, so next question. Anybody? Okay, so the lady right there.
Thank you for the great lecture. I'm from also Japan.
Yes.
And I'd like you to share your knowledge. I'd like you to share your knowledge and opinion about difference between Japanese entrance area and Western entrance area. I thought it's, as a Japanese person who lived in Japan more than 30 years and then came here to live here like almost 10 years, I thought it's very big differences between entrance in US and Japan. And here I always feel very weird when I see entrance door from the living room. So I think what you told us today is really happening, in Japan, like hiding. And I hear it's not really happening. That's what I feel. So I want you to share, your idea about the entrance area.
Okay. Japanese entrance area, for those who are not familiar with Japanese term, is called genkan. And it is actually not just a set of doors, but a space that gradually invites you in. So just as you saw in Katsura Detached Palace, the door itself is very thin, so that's the first layer or boundary in motion that you come in. And although you are within the architecture, you are still on the ground level. You're not on the floor. So you go through one boundary, but you are sort of still outside. And then usually the people inside, the host, will welcome you there when they are standing on the floor, which is usually a foot higher than the ground, and you will be invited in. And what happened is that there's another boundary, open boundary there, that you don't see, it's not like you have walls, but there's a height difference that reminds you the space inside it is different from the space that is out, in front of the steps. So I guess what happened in Japanese entrance area genkan is to gradually invite you in instead of this is outside and this is inside. And that create the opportunity for you to become a part of the house slowly. At the same time, for the people inside, they can differentiate to which extent that they invite you. If you're not invited guest, they may say, don't come in from the door. If you're just, acquaintance, you may be stopped at that step. And only when they are really feeling that you're welcome, they will invite you up to the floor. So I think that's those sort of the difference of boundary is also part of the difference of entrance, as well as the difference of how you invite the people in socially.
And that's why we take shoes off. So, any other questions? Oh, sir, right there.
Thank you, Dr. Kawai, for a wonderful, very inspiring presentation.
You're welcome.
My question is, in regards to what you shared, mindfulness in Japanese architecture, is any role of elements of nature, as in Vastu Shastra from India or Feng Shui, is there anything incorporated subtly? Is there a direct or indirect influence of those elements and those principles?
Are you talking about the nature in general?
Yes, the elements of nature, or
Yeah.
natural elements.
The elements of nature, or the existence of nature, is very important for Japanese architecture. And you see that there's no walls, the solid walls for Japanese architecture that sort of opens up the inside and outside feeling that you don't really know if that nature elements, whether it is air or trees or water, is outside of your space or part of your space. And in that sense, nature and natural element is very fundamental elements in, I wouldn't say designing the architecture, but creating any space in Japanese architecture. Is that okay?
Any other questions? Okay, so sir, right there.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how the conception of space in Japanese architecture might have changed after the introduction of glass and windows into Japanese architecture.
The introduction of technology or Western ideas changed Japanese architecture in an interesting way, although that I should say, let me put it this way. For one thing, before windows and glasses come in, the Westernization came to Japan. And the Westernization came to Japan and changed, or did not change, the Japanese architecture in an interesting way, because modernization in Western architecture is in a way Easternization of Western architecture, right? Because they started to use more open walls with windows and glasses, and that happened about the same period of time, the late 19th century and early 20th century. So that sort of made the change of Japanese architecture to the Western one, Western architecture to more Japanese one at the same time. The other thing that I'd like to point out about the glass is I mentioned the different degrees of shadows and different degrees of light. And although I said both, I feel that in traditional Japanese architecture, we see more different degrees of shadows than different degrees of light because of the way that the building is built. It has a deep eave, so when you are inside, you see more shadows. As you probably, if you ever read the Tanizaki Junichiro's book, that's about the different degrees of shadow. And that changed, especially recently, when the technology started to allow much larger amount of glass. You see different degrees of light in contemporary Japanese architecture, like in Sana's work, or probably in Fujimoto's work. The newer generation of Japanese architects are dealing more with different degrees of light instead of different degrees of shadows.
Okay, next questions. Okay, so the man in the back.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I love the conversation we just had about genkan and entrance in Japanese homes and how it relates to sort of Western homes. And you made an interesting comment about how the entrance may reflect how a society or a culture greets or handles greeting. And I'm curious if those behaviors of greeting are tied to the space in the architecture. And those behaviors, I assume, might be tied to the values of that society as well. So I imagine Japan has different values, which are reflected in greeting forms than the US. How do you, in your work, when you're trying to bring these spatial concepts to places outside of Japan that have different value systems and different behaviors and cultures, how do you adapt them or reconcile them with those different value systems?
I guess that you now ask two different questions. One is how the different system of entrance reflects the different society. And to answer that part of the question, I think in Japanese culture, to say in front, on the face, to say something to, if you meet the stranger, and to say, no, you cannot come in, is very difficult because of, the cultural system. And this gradual saying no by using the spatial system, it's actually not only me, the social scientists talked about it. The Japanese village does not have the wall around it. So there's no way to say no to stranger. And so when you come in, you have to say no by letting them going through the different form of boundary. In addition, since Japanese architecture does not have a solid wall inside of your house too, again, when you talk about the social distance or closeness between the people within the family or with your friends, the saying no, it's very hard to say, don't come into the room, right? So you're right that you have to, so Japanese people invent a different way to saying no again within the house by using another term, oku, meaning just as you have to open and close the door again and again to go to the deepest corner of katsura, in Japanese house, you have to do the same thing to the very private corner. So you're right that how the space is made and how society or culture is made are very closely related. And how we make that, how we translate that when our office designs something in the United States, is I think it's really depends on our conversation with our clients. How much openness that they can accept, or how much openness that they would like to have. Because what we are seeing, especially in an office setting, is it used to be people want to enclose themselves because they want to keep the information, the secret that they're producing within the office. But now they want to be open. They feel they want to be open in the workplace, but they don't know how. So in a sense, they ask us architects to make the environment so that they could be more open. So what they used to and what they want is slightly different, at least in last 5 years, and we are feeling it.
Okay, great. So the last question. Anybody? Okay, so the lady in the back.
Hi, I was very interested. So I'm working with the school and we're doing a rooftop garden. And I was just curious how your perspective could work on the garden for the kids. And we're in a very interesting neighborhood, so I would like the garden to be a place where they feel connected to nature.
Mm-hmm.
So
I guess the case of rooftop garden is interesting because it's a unique place that when you are at the rooftop, you can see the surroundings. So in that sense, the boundaries are open and you can make it very, in a way, Japanese. But at the same time, because it is above the ground, higher up to the top of the building, it's really separated from the ground. So if you are to create something for the community or for the children on the top of the building, I think the trick is how you design the path for the people to go up there. And if you can make it in a way that the change is gradual and welcoming at the same time.
Okay, great. Well, it's a great season to enjoy the rooftop garden. So thank you, Dr. Kawai, for wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.